welcome to our third audience with. Tonight we have Adrian Packer being interviewed by Tom Gibbons, who's formerly of the Tennis Foundation and currently is Head of Education and Community for the LTA. A couple of housekeeping rules. Be good if you all your screens are on speaker view. When we start in a moment, Leslie will be recording, so hopefully you're all happy with that. There will be time for questions at the end, so please store them up in the chat function. And then probably also it'd be wise if we all go to mute as soon as they start the interview. And finally, thanks to Leslie, who does all the hard work arranging all this. And let's keep the series going. And it's we all learn a lot. So over to you, Tom and Adrian.
Thanks, David, and hello, everyone. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Adrian over, I think, the last 6 years. And he really has got such a fascinating background. I'm sure we'll have a really interesting chat over the next half an hour or so. So, Adrian, welcome again. I was reading your piece that you wrote recently for the One Team Bulletin, and I'm sure your fellow councillors would have been pleased to read the fond remarks that you made around Cathy Sabin being your inspiration for applying to become one of our new councillors. How did you first meet Cathy, and how did she make such a strong first impression on you?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for the opportunity for sharing some of these stories. The story of Cathy is really heartfelt because she had quite a profound impact, not just on me, and I know everyone she met, but I was astonished at her generosity of spirit and the way that she gave up time to the children I look after. So I run schools in Birmingham, and she visited one of those schools. Roy referred to it on another occasion, and we were just told some counsellors are coming. It all sounded very serious, and we were really nervous about it, and wanted to put on a really good show. And Cathy was there, and she had a teaching background, so it wasn't a surprise that she could have such an affinity with the children and was very good with talking to them. But in the last audience with Shiv talked about on the diversity and inclusion piece, he talked about this idea that I hope we get this right, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And the thing for our children that we look after is some of them are really nervous about the dancing, or don't know how to dance, or are frightened of dancing. And what I saw of Cathy is she encouraged them to dance. She gave them permission, and she inspired them and empowered them. And it was remarkable to watch. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen anyone do that so quickly. So I suppose some people might call it charisma. There was just something really special about her, and it was an important moment in our journey of school improvement, because the schools we take on have had problems, because we felt that this thing called tennis really cared about us, and that was through all the counsellors that visited, because actually they all took the time, and they all had a genuine curiosity about what we were doing and wanted to support it. But there was just something magical about Cathy. So when this opportunity came up, I just felt that somehow I owed it to her to step forward and step up. So it was an easy decision, but it's also it was an emotional process to go through, but an important one, and I just hope that I do a decent job for her.
I remember that school visit well, actually, at the primary school over the road, and we actually lost Cathy for a short period of time, slightly panicking, and she was actually found around the corner with a gaggle of sort of reception children on a sofa, sort of reading a story and stuff. Yeah. It was, I remember that very fondly. I'm sure most people will have heard about the Trojan horse scandal, and you referenced it briefly there around Cathy's visit, as it was known in the media. But for those that maybe aren't aware, perhaps you could briefly explain what that was, how you ended up being the person that government sent in to sort it out, and I guess as a final point, how exactly you used tennis to help improve the situation that you were sent into.
Yeah. So why the government sent me in is a mystery. I think everyone else said no. So maybe I was the first person to say yes. And I did underestimate it. It was, so there's a lot written about it. It's a very complex affair that that's been reported in lots of different ways. And you can take different takes of what actually happened. But basically there was a fundamental breakdown in governance of schools in Birmingham. And many children were let down by adults that created governance structures that meant that the children weren't as safe as they should be. And I'm sure everyone would agree that every child should be safe in our schools in this country. And it was identified by Ofsted that the children were at risk of extremist ideologies. And it was a very complex affair around the way not only how schools are governed, but how schools are led, and it also touched on the idea of what we mean by diversity and inclusion, and that had also become something that was had led to, in many ways, a misunderstanding of what that means, because actually what had happened was the schools had become very introspective, and they'd kind of lost touch of the wider landscape of the city, the region, the country. So my job was to, I suppose, address the fact that these schools had suffered such institutional self-esteem harm because they had been targeted by the media. And my first day at work, there were helicopters, media helicopters, and journalists, on the doorstep of the school. It was really tricky, and for the children that's very distressing. So I did two things really. One is to create a degree of normality, and two was to connect the school to the outside world, because it had become so inward looking. And really this is where you come in, because we had met before, and I was really struck by how progressive tennis was around working with so-called minority groups. And I just saw an opportunity. I thought we could be good for tennis, and tennis could be good for us. And there had been a newspaper story about how girls weren't allowed to play tennis in one of the schools. And I thought, well, girls are going to play tennis. It's a bit of a running joke now. Whenever I visit the schools, the head teachers always make sure that when I arrive, girls are playing tennis, just to keep me happy. But anyway, I just saw an opportunity, and we hadn't spoken for a couple of years because I was doing something else in Liverpool, and you were very pleased to help, and your colleagues and tennis in general were pleased to help. And it was really important for our students and our staff, because they thought, well, this thing called the LTA, it's quite grand. It sounds like something that's not for us, suddenly was for them. And this goes back to Kathy, the fact that someone that's so important could connect so easily. So in that sense, although she wasn't status driven, she's very aware of her status and the way she could empower people. And so it made a real difference to our confidence, really. It just made us feel better that this sport cared about us. And hopefully, it was the beginning of a collaboration where we could also suggest, well, if you want to work with minority groups, this is a way to do it. So I think it's an element of win-win.
And what would your answer be to someone that maybe challenged, well, why tennis? Shouldn't you have been focusing on English, maths and science, some of the really important things when schools are in the situation that they were?
It's not either or. I think it's important to focus on core subjects, but my background is that I worked in the theatre, so I come from an arts background. And my father was a professional boxer, and I had before I came back to Birmingham to work in these Trojan Horse schools, I had worked with Everton Football Club and set up a free school using the power of sport to get children interested in education. So I'd seen what you can do when you use the arts, what you can do when you use sport, and more broadly culture, and the impact that can have on children and young people in a way that goes beyond English, maths and science. It's not to say it's more important than, but you've got to get the balance right. But also in the situation of these damaged schools, it will say, again, I said about being outward looking, it's saying there is a world out there and there's other things you can do. It doesn't just have to be about the academic side of coming to school. And I think that made a real difference. It was almost as though it was giving permission to staff and students to make those connections and make those partnerships. And by the way, I was really clear that when I went to Birmingham, there was no way I could do this on my own. This job was way too big. So I needed friends. I needed to dip into my address book and contact people to help me out. So I used the people I'd worked with when I was working at a place called the Brit School, which was where I was teaching for a long time, and my contacts in the world of sport and physical activity. So I needed help, and I got it. I have to say, I was really privileged that people did step forward.
So you mentioned the Brit School. Tell us a bit more about your time. I think you're a senior artistic director.
Yeah.
Then you went on to LIPA in Liverpool. So
yeah. So the quick version of the story is I joined a circus in Mexico when I was 17. Obviously, who doesn't? So then I became, I got my equity card, became an actor, worked in musical theatre, toured Europe, and that kind of thing. And then I got to a time in my life where in the early 90s, I had children, and I thought I probably need a proper job. And this place called the Brit School had been set up, which was set up by the music industry, and it was designed to nurture future generations of talent in the creative industries. And it had a bumpy start, so I was brought in to try and develop the quality of provision at the Brit School, and then that led me to LIPA, which is in Liverpool Institute of Performing Arts, and that was set up by Paul McCartney. And I supported with setting that place up too, and it was wonderful. I had a great time. I loved all of it. It's very exciting, lots of interesting young people to interact with and teach. But after a while, it just people became really interested in what's it like to teach Adele, for example. And it's really great teaching Adele, but it's really great teaching lots of other lesser known young people. So I wanted to really think about how my life in education would be about making a difference rather than arousing curiosity, because I taught pop stars. So it started to wear really thin. So during my time in Liverpool supporting LIPA, I got talking to Everton Football Club and decided with them that we could use the power of sport to get children who are really marginalized and outside of school and disengaged, disenfranchised, and frankly at risk of ending up in the criminal justice system, to bring them back into education through using the power of sport to generate that kind of interest. So my life in education is in two halves. I've got the kind of rock and roll, Brit School, glamorous, exciting, wonderful privilege. I mean, I've got what I think is the bigger privilege of really making a difference to children whose life chances have been impacted by institutional barriers or prejudices or just their circumstances.
I think we probably need to go back to something you said in your previous answer. You ran away to join the Mexican circus when you're 18, and you skipped over that pretty quickly. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
I could tell you quite a bit about it. So go back to the party analogy and being invited to dance. So my dad was a professional boxer. I was born into quite a glamorous situation where my dad had just finished boxing. He's quite well known. My mum was kind of a hairdresser to celebrities in London, that kind of thing. And I don't remember any of this, but life was really exciting and dynamic. And then my father was unwell, and we fell on hard times. And I found it very difficult, as from the age of about 6 to 12, to really understand where I fitted in. So going back to that idea, I didn't know how to dance, if you use that same analogy. So I ended up quite literally learning to dance, and because I quite like the idea that it was a secret, because you got really bullied in the 80s, 70s and 80s. If you went to dance lessons, it's like, boys don't do that. It's like, it's just not good. So I did it in secret from about the age of 12. And then things got more complicated at home. My dad got more unwell, and I really lost my way. And the only thing that made sense was really the kind of dance that I was doing. And then an opportunity came up for me to get an equity card, which is what I needed to become a professional performer. But it was to work in a circus in Mexico. And I didn't have a clue where Mexico was, by the way. Absolutely no idea, but I thought it sounds all right. And so I got a contract as a dancer in the circus in Mexico, but they realized I had quite a talent for magic. So I had a routine. I mean, this is ridiculous stuff. I had a routine with a duck that I made disappear and reappear, and I had a slot on Mexican telly, and just life's strange. So I suddenly was really dancing, but I that's where the metaphor and the kind of literal version of my life kind of meet, because I suddenly felt I had purpose and belonging. So that's why what I do now is so important, because I want to institutionalize that feeling, institutionalize opportunity. What happened to me was partly accidental. I met someone and they said, yeah, audition for this circus, it's fun, you'll be fine. So my commitment now to young people is to make sure that those that don't feel they have a voice, or they don't belong, or they don't know how to belong, is to create a mechanism to allow them to progress into society in a way that makes them feel they have something to offer, and they have value, and they can be positive citizens, which is I appreciate it's quite aspirational, but I like doing it.
Did you play tennis back then when you were younger and learning to dance age 12?
On my own. I didn't know. I knew I'd worked out it was a game involving more than one person, but so for all the reasons I've talked about, I struggled with friendships, and I was quite awkward. And believe it or not, I am quite shy in a way. So I didn't know how you end up finding someone. But what I did, I've got a racket, I got a ball, and there was a switch shop wall at the end of my road, and I hours and hours and hours and hours, and it was absolutely my therapy. And I think Shiv mentioned this last time. There's something very therapeutic about it. It wasn't until my children started to take an interest in sport when they were at like primary school, is I realized I could play tennis with my children. So the first time I played with a net and people was with my children, and they've grown up with it. It's been our sport. It's been the thing that really bonds us as a family. We do tennis, and it's so special and magical. And we go to, they live in Stratford in East London, so we go to the courts there, and we love every minute of it, but it's competitive beyond belief.
I can imagine.
I love it.
Bringing it back to today, I've spent a fair amount of time over the last year speaking to Julie and Ollie and explaining what a tough time teachers and schools are going through with COVID, more so than ever before. But let's hear it from the horse's mouth. How has it been over the last year and a bit?
The Trojan horse's mouth. I'm very careful, is the headline on this, to not speak too negatively about the impact, because we're in danger. As a leader in education, I think I've got to set the tone of where we are, and it's easy to be very pessimistic about what's happened. And there's in my view, there's too much talk of gaps, being left behind, this whole idea of we've got to catch up, and all of that's true, of course. But I'm trying to find the language of optimism and say, well, maybe there's an opportunity here to reset and rethink what matters. And I know, so we were talking earlier, weren't we, about your schools program, and you've seen far exceeded your expectation, the take up. And I don't think I'm not surprised, because I think schools are rethinking what matters. And in the past, they may have said, oh, we can't, we just haven't got the time for this extracurricular activity. I think now schools are thinking, our kids have had a miserable time, we need to give them some joy. And they see the kind of program you're running as an opportunity to bring some joy back into the lives of children and young people. And I think that's critical. It has been tough though, the more the vulnerable children that we look after have become more vulnerable. The at-risk children have become more at risk. There's some scary things happening out there on the streets of Birmingham and other cities and all across the country, because when you take away all of that routine and all that structure from a child's life, and if they haven't necessarily got that at home, then it will have a knock-on effect. So we are going to, down the line, we're going to face significant societal challenges because of this long period where children have been out of school. So we do need to accelerate what we do with them and for them. And I believe it's in a moment in time to say, let's do more performing arts, let's do more tennis, let's do more of the other stuff that perhaps has been pushed aside in the past.
Yeah. Core Education Trust, your organisation that you founded, was founded on and named around the 4 values that you created. And I think you're aware that we at the LTA developed a set of values a few years back, and we take them incredibly seriously.
Yeah.
How does Core live its values day to day throughout the academic year?
It was so when I for my interview to become a counsellor, I was really struck by the obvious parallels between the core values and the LTA values, and they're the kind of values that you'd expect in most organisations that have the kind of ambitions that we have, that the LTA has, even though we're very different kinds of organisations, but they're just words. So it's what do you do with the words? And I'm really proud to be a leader that is working with a team of head teachers and staff and students who, just today I went into a school, they've won a science competition, and the conversation is around the values and what they mean to the children. So it's about day-to-day conversations and the values being woven into those conversations so that the words have meaning. And it's, I think, critical if you're promoting a message that you attribute meaning to the message, and you're seeking out meaning to the message, because I think then it has authenticity, and I think you can lead people better when they feel they're part of something authentic.
So we're moving into our last half term of the academic year, and it's been another tough year. What's next for Core Education Trust, kind of once we hopefully get back to a sense of normality in terms of more longer term and strategic thinking going forward?
We're really rethinking. We're working on a much longer term vision, and in that vision we are saying there's an opportunity here to recalibrate and work out what's important, and we've kind of landed on 3 words, and that's the idea of optimism, ambition, and oneness. And again, some of this chimes with what, you know, we're all one team, and there's that idea that, of course, if you create that culture of oneness, you're stronger. The optimism is a direct response to what's been a difficult time, and we have to be optimistic, and we should be ambitious. We should seek to do to innovate and to provide opportunities to the students we look after. I suppose opportunities that can be transformative, and that's because, again, going back to the original point, the majority of children we look after face institutional barriers, systemic barriers, and our job is to bash them down and create new opportunities, and to be proactive. It goes back to how we first met, because I proactively said, come on, let's do something, and you said, yeah, let's. And it's surprising how often that happens, because we all care about the future generation. You know, there's no one that doesn't care about children. We've all been one. So we all get the importance of really focusing on their futures, and I think now more than ever their futures really matter because of the hardships that they've faced in the last 12 months.
So you look after, I think it's about 3,500 futures in 4 schools across Birmingham at the moment.
Yeah.
Will there be more schools? Will you take on additional schools, whether it's in Birmingham or beyond?
Yeah, I think almost certainly, but I think the danger sometimes is you can just grow your numbers of schools, because it's this idea that bigger is better. I think better is better. So, you know, we've still got some work to do. Don't forget, we take on really damaged schools. It doesn't happen overnight. So I always advocate that we get things right, and then we can think about doing more of the same. So yes, but not yet.
So wrapping up, in terms of your new role as a board nominated LTA councillor, what are you looking forward to the most? What's your take on where the organisation's at with its kids and schools activities? And what do you think we should be doing next when it comes to that really important area of work and moving more into the community as well?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in that idea of I've talked about the second half of my career looking after children, young people who we might see in the margins of society. I really like the idea of reach. Where haven't we reached with tennis? You know, there's that the film that's coming out tomorrow that I watched earlier that shows how far-reaching tennis is and can be. So my ambition, and I talked to you, you know, when I first met you and got to learn about the LTA, I was struck by how progressive it was, and continues to be. And I think, well, okay, so what do we do with that mindset, and what is the potential of reach? Of course, I have a particular interest in children and young people, but actually this is for everyone, all communities, and you know that I want to see someone with a hijab playing on centre court one day as well. That's a particular interest, just so that because there's so much great work happening out there. I'd like to see that emerge into that kind of elite forum at some stage, because I think that becomes then we create the role models, and it is a continuum. I don't see participation over here and the elite part as something separate. It's a continuum. My dad, who became a very successful professional boxer, as I said earlier, was in a gang as a kid. He was off the rails. He would have gone to prison. So for him, boxing was accessible. So he would have been part of what we might call now a participation program, and he became an Olympian. So it is a spectrum, and I really believe in that.
Definitely. You'll be pleased to know that's the end of the grilling from me. Thank you.
Not too bad.
However, I think we're handing over to Leslie just to facilitate some questions from the rest of the group.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, may I just say thank you so much for sharing your background and the experiences that you've had. Just been so interesting listening to it, and also inspiring how you've worked with different groups of children in the Birmingham area as well. Just fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So Dave did actually start one of the questions on quite a light-hearted note that you might have seen, but he wondered, when we do have a face-to-face meeting at council meetings, that in a lighter time, you might be able to show us your disappearing duck magic.
Well, now, okay, so yeah, you have to have the right duck. I don't have the duck. You have to have the right kit. I haven't got the kit, but I'm sure we can recreate something. but I would want to do it as we'll do it. We'll work out a way to do it together as a group, rather than all the pressure on me to make the duck disappear. Because guess what? The duck didn't really disappear. It's magic. It's all an illusion.
Well, we look forward to it, Adrian.
Okay.
Right, so back on a more serious note now, we had a question from Sandy to say there's a lot of evidence that daily physical activity helps primary children with their overall learning. So why do so many schools not do this?
It's an absolute mystery to me. But I think the answer is because what schools choose to do generally depends on what Ofsted say they want to see schools doing. It's a little bit the tail wagging the dog, and the problem with that is, and I've done a lot of lobbying, and I've worked a lot with the Department for Education and Ofsted to try and push physical activity up the list of things that matter. But we are at crisis point, and we have been for a long time. In secondary schools, I can't remember the exact data on this, but the the least fit child in the middle of the 80s in a secondary school would be one of the fittest children today. That's how far we've drifted. And there's a real problem around, not only in terms of lifestyle choices and the way children, young people are living their lives in their spare time, but there is a problem around the way schools prioritize physical activity and resourcing it, and then monitoring it. My view is it's fundamentally important to our schools. The physical well-being and the mental well-being of our children is paramount, because how can they be successful learners and then successful citizens if they're not healthy? So it's challenging, but the challenge is very much about the way our system works. And I don't get into Ofsted bashing at all, but schools are motivated by the way they're judged, because we've created a system where schools need to present themselves as being a good school based on whatever the criteria is. And physical activity barely gets a mention in the framework, although it does get a mention now. It didn't used to get any mention.
There is a story of one of the Ofsted inspectors at one of the schools that visited Adrian's primary school in the early days of playing tennis for 20 minutes during an inspection, which I'm not sure if that was a distraction tactic or not, but it was a big win for tennis that day.
It was a distraction, yeah. But you've got to, I think also you have to show examples of how it can work. And that's really what we tried to do. We tried to show other schools how you can, for example, in the old days where parents' evenings, where parents actually came into school, there's a lot of time where parents sit around. Well, what we started doing was say, here's a tennis racket, go and play tennis while you're waiting. And it's just a really simple thing, and it's fun, and no one gets hurt. And it's just you've got to sometimes just be a bit imaginative. But it's a real issue. It's a real challenge.
Yeah, I think it's particularly challenging in secondary schools as well to get actual tennis on the national curriculum during the time, that they have lessons, rather than just as an extracurricular activity where a coach come in and takes a club. So, it's sort of breaking that down. But what brought you to think that tennis could be the activity that might demonstrate the positive benefits of sport that you spoke about earlier?
Yeah, So I think on a personal level, it's this idea that I always found it to be so therapeutic. So I think in my DNA somewhere, there was this idea that that tennis is healing. I just think it was just a personal thing. But then there was also this, I mentioned before, this backstory of these media stories of tennis for girls was banned. And I thought that was intolerable. And I wanted to really confront that, and also turn the narrative on its head, that not only can girls play tennis, that they can really enjoy it and be good at it. So there was that element, and then there's just the whole point that it's relatively easy to get kids playing tennis. It doesn't require I think sometimes we think we've got to have all the very best equipment and lovely courts. You don't really. I mean, you can set it up relatively easily. We didn't see too many barriers. And the other issue, I suppose, that we wanted to promote was the idea that I really like competition. And I think that sometimes we get nervous and apologetic about competition in schools. And I love competition. I think in itself, competition can be really inclusive, because everyone is naturally competitive, in my view. There's no one that says, I'm not interested in that game because it's competitive. People want to get involved. So tennis lent itself well to that competitive element.
Okay, so I've had an interesting question here come in. It says, were there any similarities that you encountered with your schools in Birmingham that has happened recently with the school in Dewsbury? It was highlighted in the press, where you talked about ethnicity and the problems that those.
Well, there's a book coming out about this. So it's what's really complex about this whole subject, and again we touched on it in the last audience with Shiv, is we can sometimes get too nervous about the way we speak about these issues. That and I understand that, and I understand the sensitivities around that. But one of the problems that we continue to face in the communities we serve is that when we look at protected characteristics, sometimes they clash. So there were protests outside other schools in Birmingham last year, where some of the parents of the Muslim children that we look after in the east of the city were protesting about the way sex and relationship education was delivered, and fundamentally it was about homosexuality, and that's another protected characteristic. So we have a situation where we've almost got an argument between different protected characteristic groups, and I think we've got to work really hard just to create better conversations where and again, this is something I've heard us discuss around listening and giving people time to be able to listen and to hear another point of view. I get nervous when we have we've got a lot of discussion at the moment about Palestine and whether children and parents should be allowed to protest about that at school. I think school is a place for eloquent debate rather than just protest in isolation doesn't really lead to much. I want people to have a voice. I want people to express their opinions, but I'm much more interested in the dialogue and the conversation. So the big thing for me when I first went to Birmingham and underestimated the challenge was to open up dialogue and bring parents in. But the problem is it got quite abusive. So, and a lot of that abuse to me was about my race. And so I had to learn to understand that and not take it personally.
So when we think about our volunteers, because we as a sport rely heavily on volunteers, is there any way that we can increase the diversity of our volunteer workforce, looking at the parents that you've dealt with and things like that?
Yeah, that was the beginning. Yes, and that was the beginning of my journey with Tom, which is to say this is a win-win. I think tennis, the sport that I love so much, could do with looking a bit more diverse, and that's across all levels of tennis, whether that's community or elite, or just the people that turn up and watch it. So it's certainly possible, but it doesn't happen quickly. It takes time. And I've always said to Tom, there will be a time lag. It won't be now. I'm hoping it will be soon. I'm certainly hoping it will accelerate now that I have this privilege of being a counsellor, because I'm going to make it my business to accelerate that agenda. But I think you're absolutely right to highlight that space, the volunteer space, because it should be quite an easy win. We should be able to get a more diverse group of volunteers visible, and that's for me is the key, is the visibility of it, because it goes on. When I talk to Tom about the work that he does, it's all happening, but I think we need to accelerate the visibility of it. If you can accelerate visibility, I'm not sure you can.
Yeah, and I've got one more question come in here, and it's about elite players and the sort of trying to structure school life in around what they're trying to do from an elite performance level. And there's often resistance from the state sector in particular about children having time off to attend training and getting the additional support they might need academically. Any advice on that sort of side of things?
That we should do everything we can to support every child with their individual journey. I mean, we should accept that there isn't a one size fits all journey. I mean, Sandy often says my background is colourful. I call it bendy, and I think we should embrace the bendy. And if a child shows that they've got an aptitude in anything, whatever it is, and an appetite, and that's a positive endeavour, get behind the child, make it work. Now, that happens in our schools. Does it happen in most other schools? Not really. And that comes back to, again, the pressure that schools feel about what matters. So we need to do, this is where I think the lobbying piece is so important. We've got to get out there that this stuff matters, because it actually leads to a healthier, happier society. you know, not just GCSE results. There is more to life than that. So I really recognize that problem, and it frustrates me. I think we have to absolutely, you know, I said about breaking barriers. It's not just about barriers of prejudice. It's also about barriers that are somehow built into our school system, because a child going off to, I don't know, to pursue an elite pathway is somehow seen as an inconvenience. Well, I think that's nuts.
Yeah, no, I'm from an educational background as well, and I just think you celebrate anybody's
100%.
talent, whatever that might be. Just celebrate it to the utmost, and
make it work.
Yeah,
make it work.
absolutely.
And actually be a stakeholder in it. So ask that. I mean, we have situations where if that happens, we'll make sure that we can support with transport, for example, or we put in place various additional tuition in and around that child's timetable. You've got to make the effort, but the effort's worth it, because.
Can I just say something?
Yes.
I've got 2 children that have gone through the tennis education side, and I think it's about communication.
Yeah.
And that's one, you know, right from the early age with William and Amelia, I've gone actually into the school, sat down with the head teacher and told them exactly what this could be. I'm not saying it would be, but could be. And I've had thank goodness, every, you know, support from them. And, you know, they both went, well, one went to private school, one went to state school. And they both of them have had the support, because I think right from the outset, that's what I wanted for my children, my 2 children. And I really do thank those schools for what they did. And I think it is out there. I think, you know, the schools are there, but I think it needs communication right from the beginning, from the parents. And not only that, I was a parent that made sure that they caught up with their work. They did their work and handed it in, because I always said to Amelia, if you don't do what they want you to do, they're not going to let you off. And I think that's where the parents have to be strong as well.
Yeah, and it is a partnership.
You know,
it's a partnership between parents.
Yeah, I think it's a big partnership. Yeah, definitely. But as I said, I've had a great experience of both of them, thank goodness. But you know, I do think it can happen and it can work, and I think that's important.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for coming in with that, Liz, as well. But if I can just hand back over to David, just to say thank you and wrap things up for our interview this evening, and really appreciate everything that you shared with us, Adrian. It's been, you know, a real insight into what you've come through. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, absolutely, Adrian. Thank you. It's very enlightening. Tom, thank you very much for interviewing. I was just put on the chat that you and I had the sort of pleasure of meeting Gavin Williamson, the Education Minister. He was very, very open to bringing all sports to schools. So I think there is some light at the end of the tunnel. We just got to keep campaigning and sort of get in front of these people. I don't know if you've had the chance, Tom, yet to get in front of him, but he did make that offer to us, didn't he?
He did. Scott has followed up and had a meeting with him, which is great.
But we should take that as an action, because I have a regular dialogue with the Secretary of State about such issues. So Tom, let's join forces and let's get in there.
We were up in Walsall doing a presentation to a community tennis sort of hub. It was he was there for a couple of hours, and really it wasn't just go through the motions. He meant it, so I was impressed with that. But thank you very much, both of you, and thank you everybody else for attending. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Right here now, we've got sunshine in between the showers.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.